The palace of the Zirath Empire was silent, but the silence was heavy and sharp, like a blade waiting to fall. Tall pillars carved from dark stone lined the great hall, and golden light poured through the high glass ceiling, reflecting on the walls. The air was tense because the queen was angry, and when Queen Serathis was angry, no one dared to breathe too loudly. On the throne sat the alien queen, tall and proud, her armor shining under the light. The armor was not just clothing or protection. It was a symbol of her power, her history, and the strength of the Zirath. For centuries it had never been broken, never been scarred. It was said that the living metal itself had chosen her as its wearer, and it obeyed only her commands. But now, for the first time, that armor was damaged. A long scar ran across its chest plate, and parts of it had lost their glow. The queen had returned from a recent battle victorious, but not untouched. That scar on her armor felt to her like a scar on her pride. It whispered that she was not untouchable anymore, and that thought filled her with fury. The court stood around her in silence. Advisors, soldiers, nobles, and scientists all lowered their heads. They waited for her to speak, but when she finally did, her voice cracked like thunder through the chamber. "Who dares to bring me this shame?" she shouted. Her words echoed in the tall hall. "Who among my finest minds, my greatest engineers, can repair what has been broken?" No one answered. The sound of silence pressed down harder. The queen's red eyes swept across the hall. No one wanted to meet her gaze for fear of being cut down in rage. Even the strongest generals shifted nervously. The living metal armor had been studied for generations, but none had ever truly mastered its secrets. The queen rose to her feet. Her tall frame and sharp crown made her look more like a force of nature than a ruler. She slammed her gauntleted fist against her throne. The sound was like a crash of stone. "Speak," she roared. "Are there none among you who can restore the honor of your queen?" "Must I wear broken armor before my enemies and my people?" Again silence. Fear grew in the room. The scientists exchanged glances, but none dared step forward. The metal of the armor came from a source older than their empire itself. It was said to be alive, and to repair it required a skill no one had. The queen's anger rose higher. She paced before her throne, her steps loud and heavy. "Am I surrounded by cowards?" she demanded. "Is this empire full of fools who can fight but cannot mend? Answer me!" For a moment it seemed no one would. The chamber was frozen, the fear thick as smoke. And then, from the back of the hall, a voice spoke. It was not loud, but it carried clearly. "I can," the voice said. Heads turned. Shock spread through the gathered aliens. Standing near the back among servants and guards was a human. He was not tall like the Zirath. His body looked weaker, his clothes plain and dirty from work. He was a mechanic, a slave taken from a distant planet, Earth. His name was Daniel Kane. He had been in the palace for years, fixing broken machines, maintaining small systems, always working quietly in the shadows. Few noticed him, and most thought humans were too simple to be useful in higher matters. But now he had dared to speak when no one else would. The court erupted in whispers. "A human?" one noble hissed. "Impossible," another sneered. The advisors looked offended. To them, the thought of a human repairing the queen's sacred armor was laughable, even insulting. The queen raised her hand and the whispers stopped. Her eyes locked on Daniel. "You?" she said slowly, her voice dangerous. "You dare claim you can fix what even my greatest minds cannot?" Daniel's heart pounded, but he did not lower his gaze. He knew the risk. A single wrong word could mean his death. But he also knew something else. He had been studying Zirath technology secretly, learning from scraps of information, from broken tools, from every chance he had. He had noticed things that others ignored, and he believed he had an answer. "Yes," Daniel said firmly. His voice was calm but respectful. "I can repair your armor." The queen narrowed her eyes. For a long moment the hall was silent again. Everyone expected her to strike him down for his arrogance, but instead she tilted her head, intrigued. "Tell me," she said, "why should I not tear you apart for your insolence?" Daniel swallowed but stood his ground. "Because you want your armor whole again," he replied. "And no one else has spoken. No one else has tried. If you allow me, I will show you." The queen's lips curled into the smallest of smiles. It was not kindness, but curiosity. She was used to fear and obedience. But here stood a fragile human who dared to meet her eyes and offer something no one else could. The court was shocked into silence. The idea was madness, yet the queen raised her hand. "Bring the armor," she ordered. Two guards carefully carried forward the damaged chest plate. Its surface was dull where once it glowed, and the long scar seemed almost alive. Daniel stepped closer. The crowd watched him as if he were walking to his own doom. He examined the armor with careful eyes. His fingers traced the edges of the scar, feeling the grooves. His mind raced. He had studied Xerath metals before, and this was different. It was not just metal. It pulsed faintly, like it breathed. He realized then what the others had missed. The armor was alive but wounded. It needed not force, but care. Daniel looked up at the Queen. "It is not broken," he said quietly. "It is hurt, and if I am right, it can heal." Gasps filled the hall. Some laughed in disbelief. But the Queen raised her hand again, silencing them. "Go on," she said. "Prove your words," Daniel nodded. He asked for tools, for small parts, for access to certain energy systems. The aliens hesitated, but the Queen's order was absolute. As the court watched, Daniel began his work. He did not hammer or force the metal. Instead, he listened. He adjusted connections gently, applied heat in places that seemed lifeless and cooled areas that burned too hot. Slowly, carefully, the scar began to change. Hours passed. The court grew restless, but the Queen remained seated, her eyes never leaving the human. At last, Daniel stepped back. The armor glowed faintly again. The scar had not vanished, but it was no longer raw. It looked as if the armor had begun to mend itself. The Queen rose, stepping forward. She touched the repaired plate, and for the first time since her defeat, it pulsed with life. The living metal responded to her command once more. She felt its strength return, and with it, her pride. She turned to Daniel. Her voice was quieter now, but more dangerous. "You have done what none of my kind could. Tell me, human, who taught you this?" Daniel stood tall, though fear twisted in his stomach. "No one taught me. I watched. I learned. I tried what others would not. That is what humans do." The Queen stared at him for a long time. The hall was breathless, waiting for her judgment. Then slowly she nodded. "Very well," she said. "From this day you will repair my armor. You will work under my eye, and you will prove whether humans are worth more than dust." The court erupted in disbelief, but no one dared oppose her command. The Queen returned to her throne, her armor glowing faintly once more. Daniel stepped back, his heart racing. He knew his life had just changed. He had spoken where no one else dared, and now the most powerful being in the galaxy had noticed him. In the silence that followed, one thought burned in Daniel's mind. This was only the beginning. The day after Daniel repaired the scarred plate of the Queen's armor, the palace was filled with whispers. The name of the human spread from the lowest servants to the highest advisors. No one could believe what they had seen with their own eyes. A human slave touching the sacred armor and bringing it back to life. For the Xerath, it was not just shocking. It was insulting. To them, humans were weak, captured creatures who were useful only for simple work. But now one of them had stood before the Queen and succeeded where their greatest scientist had failed. Queen Serathis, however, was not angry. She was curious. All night she had sat awake, feeling the glow of her armor slowly return. It still carried the scar, but it pulsed with life again. She wondered how a human with no training in Xerath science could achieve this. Her pride did not allow her to ignore it. She had to know more. When morning came, she ordered Daniel to be brought before her throne. The guards escorted him into the great hall. He walked carefully, but his steps were steady. He knew eyes watched him with suspicion and hate, but he did not bow in fear. He stood straight, waiting for the Queen to speak. "You claim to have repaired what was thought unrepairable," Serathis said, her voice calm but heavy with power. "But one success may be luck. I do not trust luck." "I demand proof," Daniel nodded. "I understand," he said softly. "Give me another chance and I will prove it was not luck." The Queen turned to her advisors. "Bring me the broken gauntlet," she ordered. A guard carried forward a blackened piece of armor, its surface cracked and lifeless. It had been damaged long ago, left in the palace as a reminder of failures past. The finest minds of the Empire had studied it for years, but none had restored it. Serathis looked back at Daniel. "If you can breathe life into this, then I will believe your words." The human stepped forward. He studied the gauntlet carefully. The cracks ran deep, but beneath them he felt the same faint pulse he had sensed before. It was weak but alive. He asked for tools again, but this time the Queen refused. "No tools," she said firmly. "Use only what you can with your own hands." Let me see what humans are truly capable of. Daniel hesitated but nodded. He sat down on the cold floor with the gauntlet before him. The entire hall watched as he worked. He placed his hands along the metal, feeling the weak rhythm inside. He closed his eyes and thought about what the armor needed, not what it lacked. Slowly, he pressed on the cracks, adjusting them with care. He hummed softly, not for the armor, but for himself. It kept his mind calm. Minutes turned into hours. The Xyrath nobles grew impatient. Some laughed quietly, whispering that the human would fail and meet his death. But then something began to change. A faint glow spread across the gauntlet. The cracks started to seal, not fully, but enough for the pulse to strengthen. The blackened metal regained a faint shimmer, like embers returning to flame. Gasps filled the hall. Even the queen leaned forward slightly, her sharp eyes fixed on the scene. Daniel opened his eyes at last and placed the gauntlet gently on the floor. "It is not whole yet," he admitted. "But it is healing. In time, with more care, it will be strong again." The queen stepped down from her throne. She picked up the gauntlet and felt its warmth. For the first time in centuries, it obeyed her touch. She turned back to the court, her voice loud and clear. "You see? This human does what you could not. Remember this." Her words struck the hall like thunder. The advisors were horrified. To honor a human was dangerous, they thought. It would inspire rebellion among the slaves. Yet no one dared argue with her command. Sarathis turned to Daniel once more. "Tell me, how did you learn this?" she asked. Daniel's answer was simple. "I watched. I studied broken things. I tried different ways. Your people look for perfect methods. Humans, and we look for any way that works. Even if it is strange. Even if it seems foolish." The queen's eyes narrowed. "You are saying that we are blind?" Daniel shook his head. "Not blind, but proud. Too proud to try small ideas. Too proud to fail. Humans fail many times before we succeed. That is why we see things others miss." The queen was silent for a long time. Then she laughed, not with humor but with something sharper. "Perhaps pride is a weakness. Perhaps that is why I find you interesting." She turned to her guards. "From this day, this human is under my protection. He will repair my armor and serve me directly. Anyone who harms him will answer to me." The hall was stunned. The nobles bowed, though their eyes burned with anger. Daniel stood quietly, but inside his heart raced. He had survived again. More than that, he had earned the queen's protection. Yet he knew it was also dangerous. The more she trusted him, the more enemies he would have among her court. That night, Daniel was given a small chamber near the queen's armory. It was larger than the slave quarters, but still plain. He lay on the hard bed, staring at the ceiling. He thought about Earth, about the family he had lost when the Xyrath conquered his world. He had never stopped wishing for freedom, but now he held something greater, the queen's attention. If he was careful, he could turn this into an opportunity not just for himself, but for his people. Meanwhile, across the palace, whispers grew louder. Some nobles feared the queen's fascination with the human. Others plotted in secret, speaking of ways to rid themselves of him. To them, a human with influence was dangerous, perhaps more dangerous than any rival empire. But no one dared act yet. They knew the queen's eyes were sharp and her wrath deadly. As for Sarathis, she sat alone in her chamber, holding the gauntlet in her hand. She studied it under the pale glow of the palace lights. She thought about the human's words, about pride, about failure, about strange new ways of thinking. It unsettled her, but it also stirred something inside her that she had not felt in many years. Curiosity mixed with respect. For the first time in a long while, the queen of the Xyrath wondered if her empire had underestimated humanity. And for the first time, she smiled at the thought. The weeks after Daniel's second success changed the atmosphere of the palace. The queen's armor, once dull and scarred, now pulsed with new life, and whispers about the human mechanic spread beyond the walls of the capital. Some called him a trickster, others a dangerous tool, yet all agreed on one thing. He had done what no Xyrath had ever done. That fact alone unsettled the empire. Queen Sarathis, however, was not unsettled. She was curious. For centuries she had ruled through fear, strength, and her unmatched armor. But now her armor had been touched and healed by hands she would once have dismissed. She wanted to know the truth. Was this human only lucky? Or was his strange way of thinking something more powerful? She decided there was only one way to test him, through battle. One morning, the palace bell rang with urgency. The Dravik, A rival species known for their brutal raids had attacked the Empire's borders again. Their warlord, Karun, had mocked the Queen openly in past encounters, calling her the armored tyrant who hides behind her living shell. This time, Sarathis would show him the strength of her people and the skill of the human who had touched her armor. Daniel was summoned to the war chamber. The vast hall was filled with generals and commanders, maps spread across glowing tables. They looked at him with cold eyes as though he were a shadow that did not belong. Sarathis sat at the head of the chamber, her armor gleaming with the repairs Daniel had made. She gestured for him to step closer. "You will see what your work has done," she told him. "Today I go to war wearing armor you repaired. If it fails, you will die. If it holds, you will live." Her tone carried no threat, only fact. Daniel nodded. "Then I will pray it holds," he said softly. The generals sneered, but the Queen gave no sign of doubt. Soon after, the fleet was prepared. The Queen herself led the vanguard, her flagship a massive vessel of black steel and crimson light. Daniel was placed on board not as a fighter but as an observer. She wanted him close to see his reaction when her life depended on his work. The journey to the battlefront was short. The stars outside the ship blurred as the fleet crossed the void. When they emerged, the Dravic armada was waiting. Their ships were rough and scarred like predators ready to strike. At their center stood Karun's vessel, its shape like a spiked beast drifting in the darkness. The Queen stepped into the chamber where her warriors waited. She wore her armor fully for the first time since its damage. The metal pulsed with life, the scar across its chest now glowing faintly as though alive again. She moved with precision, the suit bending to her will, faster and smoother than it had in years. Daniel watched from the corner, his heart pounding. His work would now be tested in the fire of battle. The clash began with thunder. The Dravic charged, their ships raining fire upon the Zirith fleet. Explosions lit the void like stars being born. The Queen launched forward, her ship cutting through the enemy lines. When the time came, she stepped onto the battlefield herself, leading her warriors on the surface of a shattered moon where the Dravic had landed. The ground shook beneath her feet as she struck down the first wave. Her armor moved like a second skin, its strength amplifying her every motion. Blades glanced off its surface. Energy blasts scattered harmlessly across its glowing plates. Where once the armor had been heavy, now it flowed like water, responding faster than ever before. She realized with a thrill that Daniel's repairs had not only healed it, they had improved it. Her soldiers roared behind her, inspired by her unstoppable march. The Dravic, fierce as they were, faltered at the sight of their warriors falling before her. Karun himself appeared, towering and covered in spiked armor. He charged with a massive axe, striking her chestplate with a blow meant to shatter stone. The impact rang out across the battlefield. Dust and fire filled the air. For a heartbeat, silence fell. Then the dust cleared and Sarathis still stood. The scar across her armor burned bright, but the plate held strong. The living metal had absorbed the strike, then pulsed with renewed power, sending a shockwave that pushed Karun back. The Queen's red eyes burned as she raised her blade. "You thought my armor was weak?" she shouted. "It is stronger than ever." Her soldiers cheered as she pressed the attack. Karun fought fiercely, but the Queen's strikes were faster, sharper, and backed by the strength of her restored armor. Within moments, the Dravic warlord fell to his knees, defeated. The Dravic forces broke and scattered, their courage shattered. The battle was won. The Queen stood tall, her armor glowing with life. Her people bowed in awe, and Daniel, watching from a distance, felt a strange mixture of relief and pride. His work had not only saved her, but had also changed the course of the fight. When they returned to the flagship, the Queen summoned him privately. She removed her helmet, her face stern but her eyes sharp with curiosity. "You saw what happened," she said. "The armor did not only survive, it became stronger." "Explain this." Daniel hesitated, then answered. "Because I did not try to restore it to what it was. I tried to make it better. Humans, we do not believe perfection exists. We believe everything can be improved." "Even legends," the Queen studied him silently. His words challenged the very core of Zyrath pride. They believed their creations were flawless, beyond need of change. But this human spoke of flaws as paths to strength. It unsettled her, but it also excited her. She realized that his way of thinking was not weakness, it was power. "You may be dangerous," she said at last, "but you may also be useful. From now on, you will repair not only my armor but also my weapons and my fleet. You will show me if this human craft can truly reshape war. Daniel bowed his head slightly. I will try, he said. Inside, however, he felt the weight of her words. He had become more than a slave, more than a mechanic. He had become a symbol of possibility, of danger, and of hope. And he knew others would not stay silent for long. The Queen's court would hate him more than ever. But for now he had earned a place beside her and perhaps even her respect. As the fleet sailed home, whispers grew across the stars. The Queen's armor had been broken, then repaired, not by her greatest minds but by a human. And that victory would be remembered, not as the triumph of the Xyrath alone, but as the moment humanity's name rose again in the galaxy. The battle with the Dravik became a story carried across the stars. The Xyrath returned home victorious, their enemies scattered and humiliated. Yet what most whispered about afterward was not only the Queen's triumph, but the human who had stood beside her. Daniel had not fought, yet his presence had grown heavier in the Empire. To many it was terrifying. To others it was a spark of hope. A slave had proven himself valuable in ways no one expected. But Queen Serathis was not satisfied. She was a ruler who trusted only what she could test herself. A single victory did not prove the human's worth. She wanted to know if his strange abilities extended beyond her armor, if they could touch the very heart of her people. One evening, she summoned Daniel into the palace garden, a rare place of quiet beauty among the cold halls of stone and steel. Bioluminescent flowers glowed under the twin moons, and crystal fountains whispered softly. It was a place where she allowed no guards, no advisors, only truth. You repaired my armor, Serathis said, her voice steady. And it held in the fires of war, but armor is only one part of power. A ruler does not stand alone. Tell me, human, do you think you can heal more than metal? Daniel hesitated, unsure how to answer. I only try to fix what is broken, he said simply. Sometimes that is metal. Sometimes it is people. The Queen studied him. His words were plain, yet they carried a weight her generals could not grasp. She decided then to test him in a new way. The next day, Daniel was taken deep into the city where the wounded from the Dravik battle were kept. Dozens of Xyrath soldiers lay in recovery halls, their bodies marked by burns, fractures, and scars. The healers had done all they could, but many still suffered, especially in spirit. Serathis turned to Daniel. Show me if your hands can bring them strength. Do not repair armor. Repair my soldiers. The command was nearly impossible. Daniel was no healer. But he did not argue. He walked among the injured quietly, kneeling beside them. He did not have medicines or advanced tools. All he had were his words, his patience, and the strange calm that seemed to follow him. With one soldier, he listened to stories of lost comrades. With another, he adjusted the soldier's damaged prosthetic, tightening parts with the same care he had given to armor. With others, he simply sat in silence, letting them feel less alone. Hours turned into days, and slowly something changed. The soldiers began to rise with more willpower. Their pain was still present, but their spirits grew lighter. They spoke of the human not as a slave, but as a companion. Whispers reached the palace. Some said the human carried a gift beyond understanding, a way of seeing life not through power but through connection. Others accused him of dangerous influence. An advisor warned the Queen, if you allow this, the people will follow him instead of you. But Serathis did not silence Daniel. She watched closely, measuring his effect on her empire. She noticed that where Daniel walked, arguments softened and bitterness eased. It was not weakness, it was a strength of a different kind. One night, when the city was quiet, she called him again to the garden. You have touched armor and it healed. You have touched soldiers and they rose stronger. Tell me, Daniel, what is it that humans have that we do not? Daniel thought carefully before answering. You see strength as force. But sometimes strength is not in how hard you strike, but in how much you can endure, and how much you can help others endure with you. The Queen stood in silence, her eyes reflecting the glowing flowers. For the first time in centuries, she felt uncertainty, not about herself, but about her empire. If this human spoke truth, then the foundation of Xyrath power was incomplete. Her trial was not finished, but one thing was clear. The human was no longer just a slave. He had become a question that the empire itself would have to answer. The Queen had seen Daniel's effect on her soldiers, and though she did not show it, she was unsettled. Strength was supposed to come from blades, ships, and the unshakable will of command. Yet here was a fragile human who had done nothing but speak, listen and mend small things, and somehow the Empire whispered of him. It was not something she had planned for. It was something she could not fully control. The Empire itself began to stir with divided voices. Some saw Daniel as a blessing, a symbol that even the weakest could bring light into the harsh order of the Xyrath. Others called him a danger, a distraction from true power. The nobles feared him most of all, whispering in private that the queen was blinded by curiosity and risking her throne. One council meeting grew especially tense. Generals sat around the long black stone table, their crimson insignias gleaming. One of the oldest among them rose, his voice sharp. "My queen," he declared, "this human twists the spirits of your soldiers. They rise not for you, but for his strange comfort. It is poison dressed as kindness. Remove him before he weakens us." The chamber filled with mutters of agreement. Only a few dared to argue. Sarathis did not raise her voice, but her words cut through the air. Did he not walk among the broken and give them strength when even our healers could not? Did his presence not steady us in battle when my armor was tested? You speak of poison, yet I see healing. The general bowed stiffly, but his eyes glared with quiet defiance. Daniel, seated silently at the edge of the chamber, lowered his gaze. He had not asked for any of this, yet he felt the storm rising. He was no warrior, no politician, only a man who tried to fix what was broken. But now the Empire itself seemed to tremble under his presence. That night, as he wandered the quieter halls of the palace, he found himself face to face with Calith, the Queen's chief advisor. Unlike the generals, Calith was calm, her sharp eyes like knives that cut without drawing blood. "You are changing things you do not understand," she said coldly. "The Queen may protect you for now, but know this. Empires do not bend without breaking. You are either her tool or her downfall." Daniel did not reply. He had no words that would soften Calith's warning. Instead, he simply nodded because deep down, he feared she might be right. Meanwhile, Sarathis faced her own shadows of doubt. In her private chamber, she stared at her armor, its surface reflecting faint light. The repairs Daniel had made still pulsed with quiet strength, as though his touch lingered inside the living metal. For the first time in her reign, she wondered if there was another kind of rule, one not built on fear but on something more difficult to grasp. Days later, she decided on another test. This time not against soldiers or armor, but against her people themselves. She disguised herself in plain clothing and commanded Daniel to join her in the lower city, where the common Xyrath lived in crowded districts. There, the scars of war were harsher. Families mourning, workers laboring without rest, children growing up under the shadow of endless conflict. Sarathis expected her people to bow to strength, but what she saw shook her. When Daniel walked through the markets, the people did not fear him. They approached him freely, asking him to repair a broken tool, to settle a quarrel, even to comfort a child crying for a lost parent. He gave no grand speeches, no commands, only small acts of patience. Yet each act lit sparks among the crowd. The Queen stood among them, unseen, and watched. She realized with a strange unease that her people had never looked at her that way. They respected her. They obeyed her. But Daniel, they trusted him. That night, when they returned to the palace, Sarathis spoke little. But Daniel noticed the way her hands tightened behind her back as though she carried a weight heavier than her armor. The storm within the Empire grew louder. Some nobles demanded Daniel be exiled before his influence shattered loyalty to the throne. Others argued that he should be placed under strict control, used only as the Queen's instrument. Yet among the common people and soldiers, his name began to spread like a quiet fire, an ember the Queen could not stamp out even if she wished. The Queen was left with a question no battle had ever forced her to face. Could power survive when shared, or must it always rule alone? And Daniel, the human far from his home, began to sense that his place among the Xyrath was no longer just survival. It was the beginning of something larger, something that might one day decide the fate of the Empire itself. The shadows of doubt grew longer, and neither the Queen nor the human could yet see where they would lead.